Majority of people who we are talking to start investing in treasury bonds, they raise a very significant point, especially in Uganda where we have had history that we cannot ignore. And they always say what will happen when in the future the government of the day decides to devalue the currency, like what happened in 1987 during the currency reforms. And I know they speak from a perspective of I do not want to lose my and income, my and savings and investments. But then I feel the conversation is always lost because I'm yet to see one person, one economist, to come out and fully explain what happened in 1987. Now, I'm going to try to explain this in this video specifically to address the risks of what it would mean when they are to devalue your currency, or what happened in 1987 and what that means for you as an investor. One thing that is very important to understand right away is the devaluation of the currency that happened in 1997 devalued the currency, not the asset value of whatever assets you held. A currency is not the store of value. A currency is a means of transaction. At any one time, you want the central bank of a country to know and control the saturation of the currency. The day the government, the central bank, cannot control the saturation of the currency, the paper money, it will lose the control of so many things. And in 1987, we all remember that was 1 year after the change of government that ushered in the current government of President Museveni. So they were a little bit, we had gone through almost 5 to 6 years of of the war. We still had the old currency of the obotes, and there were three things that were very, very important to remember, and which I would feel like these are the most important that we should pay attention as we discuss going forward. The economy that is Uganda, we know, was recovering from a very expensive war. At that time, the war had been very expensive to the country. There were a lot of black market for so many goods and services. The Central Bank of Uganda could not necessarily account for how much money was out there in circulation. It could not. There is what we call broad money 2, M2, for those of you who know about it. The government and the central bank should always know at any one point how much money is in circulation. And we have heard of stories right now where we have talked about that people have money as their pillows. And that was the situation we had in 1987. And the only way for them to have control at the time of the currency in saturation and was to could bring in a new currency, new paper money. But they couldn't just bring it in all of a sudden with one to one. They had to, because there was a second point that was happening in the country. The second position was there was a lot of hyperinflation. We were coming from the war, the economy was grounded on the ground, there was not so many activities, and there was a lot of hyperinflation. Interest rates were extremely high. The exchange rate at the time of the UGX to the dollar was extremely high. It was making the country non competitive to the global economy at the time. So you had to think about it from a perspective of the people who were trying to make policies for the country to rejuvenate the economy from the expensive war. One, you have a lot of money out there that you can't account for because almost the central bank was non-operating for almost from 1984 to 1986 until they came into power. Two, we had hyperinflation, which was taking it on. And for the point of inflation, let me actually bring this graph. I would want you to pay very close attention to this graph. This represents the three important interest rates that any one person should always pay attention. One, the bank rate to commercial banks, which would almost always indicate how much people are accessing private capital, the commercial bank laying rates, and interbank, which reflects the inflation rates. As you can see, in 1987, 1983, the interest rate were as low as 10%. And 1983, 1984, they rise up. By the time we reach 1985, we have reached a highest interest rate of 22% in 1984. By the time we reach 86, we are in 86 actually, you can see by 86 December, we have reached 35%. That is extremely expensive. The inflation at that time was expensive, the interest rates were expensive, and the economy was railing down. So they had to bring it into control. And that was the time when they introduced in the and at the time the interest rates reached, you can see this is at the point of 1987. At that point, that's when interest rates have reached almost 50%. Inflation is, we at that point the Ugandan economy was into what we would call hyperinflation, so expensive. By the time the government tries to now to introduce as in the new currency, trying to have control, trying to bring in economic reforms into the country, making the country more competitive, making people easily access private capital into the banks and start investing before they went into privatization. And then that's interest rates start falling down, as you can see, and then they start stabilizing where we are. So one of the things you have to appreciate, what happened is, at the point in time, the economy was on the sick bed. They needed to do something. They needed to control the black market that was happening. They needed to bring in economic reforms that needed to bolster the economy after the expensive war that the country had gone through for close to almost 1979 to 86, right? And when they devalued the currency, they devalued the currency, the means of exchange, not the value, right? And that is the other second point I want us to make to pay attention to. So let me explain what exactly happened using treasury bills at the point and even land as a comparative figure. When the devaluation happened, 76% of the currency was wiped out. And like remember we said, currency is a store, is a means of exchange. It means if you had 1,000 Ugandan shillings in 1986, right? That was now worth just um 240 two, it would be now just around 1,000 times 76%, which would be actually 24%. So that means just by okay, so that means for every 100 you could only just get 24 uh 24 shillings, which means that someone who had land of 1 million, that land now was times 240,000. But do not forget, yes, before the devaluation, that land was 1 million. Your land has not changed. Your land is still there. After the devaluation, that means that land in the new currency reform, you could no longer sell that land at 1 million. Let me put it there, right? After devaluation, you could no longer sell that land at 1 million. And this is the point people need to appreciate. If I'm to highlight it in a very nice, beautiful color, let me put it in that green there, right? After the devaluation, you could no longer sell your land at 1 million. Now that land was worth just 264,000. That is the same. If you had a car of 100,000, which you had bought before, now after the devaluation, it was just a matter of Come on, my formulas are disturbing me. So if you had a car of one you had bought at 100,000 Ugandan shillings of the Obote regime, now that car was just 24,000 in the new currency regime. If you had bought a treasury bill of 1 million, it was now worth 240,000 in the new currency regime after the devaluation. The exchange, the devaluation and introduction of the new currency has nothing to do with the value of your asset. The value of your asset was impacted by other things like a reduction in interest rates, a reduction in capital, a reduction in inflation. All those other things ended up impacting the things differently. That's why you see that after the devaluation, the land value is the same as the treasury bill value. Why? They had the same value before. There is a difference between value and currency. The devaluation did not take away the value of the asset. The devaluation took brought in take away the last currency to the new currency, which actually somehow somewhere we have been getting it, because this time around it has been inflationary in nature since 1987, when they introduced in new currencies after new currency papers, to an extent that right now we have a 50,000 currency paper. But you would have to have understood that how this graph has moved over time, and how that impacted your assets, how that impacted your investment. The devaluation had nothing to do with the value. So for those who invested in treasury bonds at the time, actually they might have even made more money, because at the point that those days when inflation was 50 to 40%, the treasury bills at the time they had interest rates of over 25% and 30%. You have to go back and ask yourself, how much was land appreciating at that time? You know, so you have to separate the two. If it ever happens in the future, of course, it impacts all of us at the same time, whether you are invested in the treasury bills, whether you are invested in land, whether you are invested in apartments, one, or whether you're even employed. Because if you are even employed, your job, if it has been paying you 1 million, all of a sudden, your contract has to change. It can no longer pay you 1 million, because that is the old money. When they introduced in, this was the old money. It was 5,000, a 5,000 paper note. You can see 1986. If you can see it here, 1986. That new paper money was replaced by this better money, which was easier in 1987. That even right now it has evolved. So you took in the 50,000 in the 5,000 note, you got a 50 note with plus a few others to for your value. Your value remained. It was like an exchange rate. It's like how someone takes 1 million UGX and they end up getting a $300. It was an exchange. It was literally introducing in a new currency of the new Uganda being exchanged for the old Uganda. And why it was done? It was done because of those other factors that the economy was in. This is a tricky topic that we're going to explore a little bit more going forward, and try to explain it and bring you examples like the Zimbabwean kwacha, what happened to them, what is happening to Zimbabwe for the last 5, 10 years, and now they're trying to manage hyperinflation. What happened to Argentina in the early 90s? A country which is in inflationary pressures, few things, they have very few limited options. Otherwise, you're about to get 1 million to just buy bread. You're better off for them to only control that is to always lower that, and for you to have what you can see the new currency that they brought in 1987 after those currency reforms. But it didn't take away that your value, whatever value you had, your value you still had that. You can see this was the 500 paperwork in 1986, before the big man was taken away by the new big man, who has also become a big man for the few years he has been in power. Thank you so